Welcome to the show. I'm Jim Flyzik. During today's show, we will discuss progress being made with cloud computing at the Department of Defense. With me today on the show are Colonel John Rozsnyai, Chief Enterprise Architect at the U.S. Army, Frank Konieczny, the Chief Technology Officer, U.S. Air Force, Dave Mihelcic, Chief Technology Officer at DISA, Sean Tierney, the Area Vice President, BMC Software, and Chris Kearns, the Vice President, Enterprise Information Solutions at Lockheed Martin. Let's get into the subject. Cloud has been around now for quite some time. I'm hearing a lot of progress being made in different areas. Let's hear from you. Let's start with Dave Mihelcic over at DISA. I know DISA is kind of right in the middle of all this with the role it plays in DoD. Give us some examples of where you see progress being made there, Dave, with cloud computing.
So I think we see progress on a number of fronts, both within DISA and across the Department of Defense. A couple of things I'd like to highlight, though. Initiative we fielded about 2 years ago called MilCloud. It's a DoD private cloud. It exists at sensitive but unclassified and classified levels. We currently have over 100 projects provisioned into that environment from across the Department of Defense with more than 5,000 virtual servers as part of those projects. Moving back in time even further, we fielded a cloud software as a service capability based on Microsoft Exchange in about the year 2010, Defense Enterprise Email. We've got over 1.5 million active users of that capability. And moving even further back, we fielded a capability based on a commercial product that you probably know as Akamai. We call in the Department of Defense the Gig Content Delivery Service, and it's basically a cloud inside the DoD network that delivers content forward to our warfighters everywhere on the globe.
Wow, a lot of hybrids there. We've been talking about hybrid clouds, private clouds, public clouds, and sort of combinations. It looks like you've hit them all over at DISA. Colonel Rozsnyai, how about over at the Army? What are some of the areas of progress that you're seeing in cloud computing?
Well, I tell you, just, we're partnered really heavily with DISA and the Air Force and some of the other service components as well. But just last year, the Army CIO released the overarching guidance called the Army Network Campaign Plan, and there's a midterm and near-term implementation of guidance along with that. And this is really the beginning of how we as the Army are working together to build success of the network and to enable our soldiers really to take advantage of cloud computing and set conditions both on the internal network infrastructure as well as the cloud security stuff. And just building upon that, we also released just last March the Army Cloud Computing Strategy, which really lays out the vision of where we're headed. And you mentioned hybrid cloud computing, and that's really the environment that we're moving to. And really the goal is to improve our mission effectiveness and increase our operational IT efficiencies to better enable the warfighter. We've also published our first version of the cloud computing reference architecture. We have 3 planned versions for that, and we're currently working this year on the second version of that. And that's really a rules-based architecture, provides some left and right limits of how we're going to leverage the technology and provide some technical implementation guidance. The other thing I would say is in July, we also published throughout the Army some guidance, some policy guidance, if you will, and that really provides that left and right limits of what things we are going to allow to move out to the off-premise side of the cloud, the things that we're going to keep on-premise, either in MilCloud or some other capabilities that we can talk about a little bit later.
Okay.
The last thing I'd tell you was that we hosted an industry day in July at Fort Belvoir. We had over 120 some odd participants for that because we're trying to develop an omnibus contract that would be leveraged at the enterprise level for all cloud capabilities. And so that was very well attended and certainly appreciate the input we got. We're looking at probably sometime in FY17 that we might have a potential award on that.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Very good. It sounds to me like some of the key things there are having the strategy in place and the planning in place, and sounds like the leadership backing and things like that are so important in order to actually, do the technology pieces of the thing and having some buy-in across the organization. Frank Konieczny, Frank, what's some of the areas you see progress being made at the Air Force with your cloud computing?
Well, we've established our managed service office, which is supposed to take care of the rationalization and the migration of the applications, and they're working right now on 10-plus pilots to actually do this. Some going into MilCloud, as Dave said, and some actually going into the commercial cloud environment. So they're doing that now to develop a process and a methodology that we're going to use for all the other 3,000 applications that we have in the Air Force. We're also looking at 2 types of platforms as a service right now. One being email, another one being our personnel inventory, personnel system, whereby people can, in the Air Force, can actually go and look at their records and their grades and things like that associated with it. It was called MyPERS. So that's being actually established as a software as a solution area. Same time, we're looking at internally into our internal clouds that are our IPNs, which is the base processing centers, as to what virtualized environments we want there, as well as looking at it in terms of a GOCO or a COCO model, whereby we give up management of the center itself, looking possibly at using pods to actually put them on bases and locations where we don't have enough MILCON to actually build up the data centers. So we're looking at various areas.
Yeah, some of those, government-owned or contractor-owned things, and maybe when later on in the show we'll talk challenges, talk a little bit about that, because over the years, just watching our program evolve here, there have been some questions on the procurement side and all. It's a little different. Service level agreements become a little different, and shared responsibilities and security and things like that. But sounds to me, let's push that back till we talk about challenges a little later. Sean Tierney at BMC Software, tell us how BMC supports their customer base in cloud and some of the things where you see progress being made in cloud computing in DoD.
Sure, Jim. One of the great things, and I think we just heard it, is the level of maturity that we've seen inside the cloud lately. If we had had this conversation a couple years back, it would have been more about experimentation and people trying to decide what can we do with cloud.
Absolutely.
And they would stand one up and then see what they could make out of it, which was really great. We're now at a point now where people are starting to implement standards. They're talking about projects. They're talking about planning, and it's become much more mainstream. It's not an ancillary part of IT. It's part of your core IT, and that's one of the things that BMC wants to help with, because we have a very core focused practice around cloud management platforms that can help people when they start to standardize business practices and operations in a cloud environment. We can help them ensconce those rules and keep them in place.
Yeah, you're exactly correct, because we have been talking about this for years now, our 10th year. And I think that first year we were like, what is cloud computing? People are still trying to get a grasp of what it all meant and how it all worked and things like that. And now it's real. And now it's talked about every day and well understood. Chris Kearns, how about Lockheed Martin? How's Lockheed positioned, and how are you supporting customers, and where are you seeing progress being made in cloud computing at DoD?
Sure. We have a portfolio of programs across all the DoD services and internally. So you mentioned hybrid earlier. Years back, we started our own internal consolidation of our data centers and have gone 43 to 3, and a lot of hard lessons learned in that. We've been bringing that to our federal customers, specifically in the Department of Defense, working closely with customers where maybe it's an application that we're managing and working with them either in a federal data center that they want to move that application into commercial cloud. So we're seeing a lot more hybrid approaches, whether it's something with the Air Force portal and looking at that, or taking advantage of commercial capabilities even just from a storage perspective. And so we're doing a lot of work in that area, and it's not just the technology components, but a lot of the aspects of the culture, the organizational structures, and the governance that we tend to put a lot of focus on.
All extremely important points, I think. The Colonel brought it up earlier, too, the governance and strategy and planning and so forth. And it's interesting, as we've watched this subject evolve, we were first talking about data center consolidations, and then cloud comes in, and it's sort of like it confuses both issues, as to what is just data center consolidation versus what goes to the cloud, and it creates challenges both. And we usually bleed over in the data center conversation into cloud kinds of issues. Let's talk about a specific program. What our listeners like to hear about sometimes is there a specific program that you could point to that you think is successful because of move to the cloud? Let's talk with Colonel Rozsnyai. Is there, if I asked you to point to a specific program in the Army that you think really is being successful because of the movement to the cloud, what would first come to mind?
Yeah, I think we've conducted a number of pilot opportunities over the last year, and one of the pieces that we've done is with our U.S. Army Recruiting Command pilot. Last year, we migrated pretty much all of our frontline recruiters over to a cloud environment, and that it was really to share unclassified and publicly releasable information and to better interact with the public. And they've seen the ability to reduce the number of days that it takes to recruit and put a soldier in boots from about 45 days to roughly about 10 or so.
Wow.
So that's a pretty successful program. We've got a couple of other pilots too we've been working with DISA on, and I think that the success out of those is that we're finding that we really have to get into the right sizing piece before we migrate. What we don't want to do is is migrate our existing environment the way it is today into a new environment. What we want to do is normalize data and become a lot more efficient as we do that migration. And so some of those pilots working with DISA is helping us to do that, as well as to shape the cloud access points that they're working so hard to implement.
Yeah, that's an excellent point too. You don't, no need to move old stuff into a cloud. You know, let's try to modernize it and harmonize it and try to make sense of our inventory and our portfolio. And maybe I think cloud sometimes offers you that opportunity too. You know, to retake a fresh look at what we have. Frank Konieczny, what do you think? If I asked you, cite a specific program that you think is really making a difference in cloud computing as a reason for helping it along?
Well, there's two things that we've been doing.
Okay.
I mean, we've been doing cloud computing for about 5 years already. Hill Air Force Base already has taken 500 applications and virtualized them already into a cloud environment. So we've been doing it for a while. We haven't done it on the commercial side or, well, it's the DISA side, but this is something that we've done, and we're using the standard platform basically that they've come up with as a basis for going forward for the rest of the Air Force. The current pilot, the MyPERS pilot, is probably going to be the biggest one that we've done on a commercial side, because it's going to take everybody in the Air Force in a customer relationship model and present information to them. That's basically, it's connected to the CAP right now. It's going through IOC. It should be ready soon, right, Dave?
The show I like. It gets people talking together, solving problems.
But you know, it's going to be it's going to be interesting because it's going to be based on it's going to be for the entire Air Force.
Right.
And so this is going to be one of the first forays into using the CAP for the entire Air Force, as well as going forward for all the airmen and making sure that they get the right response time, the SLAs.
Terrific. I love it. For our listening audience, Dave Mihelcic just handed Frank Konieczny the status report for where they are on that one. That's what's coming prepared to be on the show there. Dave, let's talk to Dave. Dave Mihelcic, how about DISA? Where's if I asked you to identify a specific program or two that you think cloud computing really has helped make successful or help improve, what would come to mind?
So I'll highlight two. First is Defense Enterprise Email. That started as a partnership between DISA and the Army over 5 years ago, where the Army came to us and said, we want you to offer us email as a service, as a cloud service. Now, at the time, Office 365 didn't exist, Azure didn't exist, so the only way to offer that was to basically take Exchange and provision it in an infrastructure as a service environment within our computing centers and within Army post camps and stations, and offer that capability. So we have over 1.5 million users in the unclassified environment, over 200,000 in the classified environment. We provide a great level of service. The Army has achieved significant savings over the lifetime of moving to that enterprise service. And we're in the process now of looking at our next generation DEE. We have an RFI that we had 17 vendors recently respond to, and we believe the next generation capability is going to be much more commercial, a managed service potentially provisioned inside our DoD infrastructure, but owned and operated by a commercial provider.
Now, excellent. We've heard about this quite a bit. I actually feel like I watched that program, the Defense Enterprise Email. Mike Krieger from Army was on a number of times before he retired, and was cited that as a program, a success program. They're working with this on a number of shows too. So it's good to hear. Good to hear these things. When they begin and they come, and now we're actually getting to phase 2 or version 2 or the modernized version.
Mind if I mention one more?
Sure.
Forge.mil is a capability we stood up, once again, more than 5 years ago that offers development as a service. We're DoD users, more than 30,000 registered developers use this as an application lifecycle management and development tool set. Initially, it was offered inside the DoD infrastructure, inside our decks. On virtualized hardware. We moved that to MilCloud, our cloud computing environment. The next step of that is we actually are now operating in a hybrid model where we develop and test inside of Amazon Web Services and then deploy and operate in MilCloud. And that in particular has been very successful for us because we're able to take advantage of very low cost pay-as-you-go Amazon Web Services rates for development, but it can be provisioned inside the Department of Defense cloud for higher quality of service, more reliability, and higher security for the operational side of that. So I think hybrid cloud is really part of our future moving forward.
Wow, cool, very cool. This cloud stuff sounds pretty important to me and sounds like really rolling along these days. Chris Kearns, what do you think? If I asked you, from your perspective at Lockheed, to look at a program in DoD that Lockheed perhaps is working with and that you think is really making a difference because of the movement to cloud, what would it be?
Sure. The one I'm most excited about is actually a small one, but
Okay.
it's a pathfinder in the sense that it's doing a couple of very unique things. We're doing work with Navy Spot War, and so earlier we talked about the opportunity to rationalize applications as we move them over. So we're doing a lot of that work. And what we've seen is a lot of software starts to overlap with one another, so you can work with the customer to make a reduced footprint. And so not only is it just about moving over to a more cost-efficient infrastructure, but it's about moving the right parts over. The second exciting piece about it is it's starting to take a hard look at level 4. So when we talk about public cloud, a lot of it's level 2 type public internet information that's been moving over, and that's had some challenges. In this case, we're starting to look at level 4 type data, which is NIPR data. And so it has a higher level. You need people with clearances that touch it. It needs to be in caged areas. The physical hardware has different separation. So we're starting to take advantage of being able to take applications and information that are in that domain space and leverage public cloud in a more secure way for that.
Yeah, that is progress too. I know for a long time we've talked about, the public stuff, the administrative stuff, one thing, but when you get into the mission stuff and classified things, that'll be a whole new set of challenges. But it looks to me like those challenges are being met also. Sean Tierney, what do you think if I asked you from your perspective at BMC, if you wanted to look in at perhaps someone you're supporting in DoD or whatever at a program that you think's really making a difference today?
Yeah, Jim, I'll answer this a little bit more generally because I think one of the things that we're most proud of is while we have an awful lot of tools that we try to support the Department of Defense and government in general with their cloud initiatives and managing the cloud infrastructure, we've also changed our delivery of our portfolio as well. We have a number of tools that people use, and in some cases, the long-term strategy might not be to use a cloud-based solution. They want it on-premise and they need it internal for whatever reason, but they need a cloud solution for interim projects. We know Department of Defense and government in general, very dynamic environment. You have projects that start up, that shut down, and you don't want to invest in a large system for that particular project when you don't know what the end state outcome is assured to be. So having the capability to use the exact same tools in a SaaS-based model delivered through a cloud environment allows you to run that project as a satellite or a hybrid of your existing infrastructure, work out the kinks there through a risk mitigation environment, and then bring it back inside when you want to. So our dynamic delivery through FedRAMP certified platforms is important to us.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's very interesting. Thinking about that, it's sort of like another model there where you do your production still in-house, but the tools sit out there in the cloud, and you pull tools in as necessary and so forth. So your actual data remains in the private cloud, but the tool sets you pull in to use periodically. So it's kind of like tools as a service kind of a thing, whatever they happen to be. Very interesting. We want to talk about. We talked about progress. We talked about some specific programs, and it's been exciting. A lot of good stuff here, but we want to switch over and start talking about some of the lessons that are being learned along the way. But before we do that, we need to take a short break. You're listening to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM. Welcome back to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM. I'm Jim Flyzik here with Colonel John Rozsnyai from the Army, Frank Konieczny from Air Force, Dave Mihelcic from DISA, Sean Tierney from BMC Software, and Chris Kearns from Lockheed Martin. We're talking cloud computing at the DoD, and we've been talking about quite a bit of progress being made. It's been an exciting couple minutes there hearing about that and some specific programs. Let's hear about lessons learned. Another thing we try to do with this show is get some lessons learned out, because there's a lot of other government agencies and colleagues that are working these similar issues, and we share some of your knowledge of things that are going on that perhaps can help them as they work their way through. Let's start with Colonel Rozsnyai, and what are some of the lessons you're learning as you work your way through these cloud issues and the migration to the cloud?
Well, I would tell you that there's probably too many to get into the time show. We've learned a lot here in the last year, and I think the biggest one is really about transparent coordination and synchronization, not only across the service components, but with our industry partners as well, to figure out what capabilities are out there and how we can leverage it. We've got to set the conditions, and we've got some major muscle movements across the entire Department of Defense, where we're building capacity, we're enhancing our security posture to really enable the soldiers to leverage cloud in a good way. The other piece is already mentioned about over-provisioning. I mean, over the years, we've got a lot of applications that we'll go doing performance metrics and monitoring on, and we find that we've really over-provisioned, and so we're underutilizing those resources. And being able to move those to a virtualized cloud environment is helping us to really right-size those as we go through. The cloud access points, we're still learning through that, and we're working very hard with DISA and the Air Force and the Navy to develop that cloud connection guide and how we're going to more transparent or more easily move through that to get into the commercial sector. And I would tell you that the last thing that I would say at this point is our migration activities as a whole. We started the pilot, we did some individual applications, et cetera, and that's not the way we need to move forward. And we kind of knew that going in, but what we've really learned, we need to be starting to bundle these by impact levels and move them in mass so we can take advantage of authoritative data sources and really normalize the systems before we go.
Yeah, excellent. I think, you kind of see that happening too over the years. In the beginning it was sort of like make it up as we go. It's like, let's try this, and then it's over time it becomes more and more formalized into a discipline with good governance and planning and strategy and things like that, and to get into standard operating procedures rather than.
We always like to have money in the bank, right, for that rainy day, and that's true with IT as well. People tend to over provision just in case they need to surge, and they want to make sure that they're covered for that.
Right.
So.
Excellent. Dave Mihelcic, let's talk about what you're seeing as some lessons learned. What are some of the things along the way that maybe you bumped into that you think are worth mentioning here?
Well, first of all, despite all the hype, it isn't necessarily always cheaper to migrate to the cloud. And I'll give you a great example of that. We migrated our DISA IASE Information Assurance Security Environment portal to the cloud. It's a portal that's accessed by industry as well as DoD mission partners that includes information on our security standards, best practices, et cetera. So we migrated that to Amazon Web Services about 1.5 years ago. And one of the things we found is because we had to stand up so many services that were an organic part of our DoD computing environment, the Defense Enterprise Computing Centers, it actually was more expensive to run that in AWS than it was to run it within our decks. So that being said, we are looking at an initiative to try to deploy cloud-hosted shared services that could be leveraged by DISA programs initially and then later on by our mission partners to basically make those services available to people who want to move their applications to the cloud, thereby reducing that burden of having to provision all of these shared services. We also have many more detailed lessons learned from these initiatives that we've gone through already, and I would like everybody to go to that portal I just mentioned, iase.disa.mil, and if you go to the cloud security portion of the portal, you'll find a number of things, including cloud security standards, as well as a best practices guide for Department of Defense cloud mission owners, and that document is publicly accessible, so please take a look at that.
Terrific. It's always good to get the plugs in too for your reports and stuff, because it's a good public service for others to get information for them to go there. So we'll definitely have to check that out. Frank Konieczny, what do you think, Frank, are some of the lessons learned along the way that you're seeing as we
the first thing is complete your inventory of your applications, or try to figure out your inventory of the applications, because you can't figure out what you have to move until you actually know what you have.
Good point.
And that's one of the things that we've been doing now for about 2 years now. And we're getting there, but it's taking a while. Secondly, after you do that, and you look at each of the applications, you have to do really an engineering analysis of the application, because you just can't move it helter-skelter and say, I'm going to move it to a commercial cloud. You have to figure out, the search capabilities that are required. You have to look at the CPU. You have to look at the storage requirements. You have to look at where the users actually are and what their access points are. And that's taking a while, but that's going to be the basis for going forward for any type of procurement activity that we have to do for the commercial clouds. And so, also that forms part of the BCA that we need to do anyways, determine if we want to do it in the middle cloud or we might do something else. They mentioned the point about the shared services. We realized that too already, that as soon as we move it to a commercial cloud, we're going to have shared services across our applications. And, there's some things like AKS and HPSS, which are pretty much standard security. We have things like electronic signature, some other bus activities. So we have to make sure that when we field something in a commercial cloud or any of our IPNs, which are our own clouds, that we have these services available to each of the applications, which is interesting because this looks like that our virtual applications are going to actually sit in another environment that we have to pay for. Because we field an application, we have to field another environment for our services that we have to pay for separately, and all the applications share that environment. So we have to figure out further then how you're going to pay for it, because it's an enterprise level cost as opposed to an application cost. So we're trying to work through all that right now. Besides, the security requirements and everything else, and we want to do provisioning, auto provisioning across all the platforms, because we realize that eventually we may have to move for various reasons, for cost reasons, for other reasons as well, that we may decide that we need to automatically move things across the environment, across all the environments. And so we're looking at all those capabilities that we need to have as we start doing our pilots and as we start actually fielding things out there, how we're actually going to proceed.
Yeah, it's good that you're taking all this into account up front. It's like the old, measure twice, cut once. Let's get the upfront stuff done to make sure that down the road, if we have to move things around, it's not like starting over from scratch again. And I know that issue on shared services, having run the Federal CIO Council for several years and trying to do things on a government-wide basis and so forth, there's a lot more to that than what meets the eye. It's not just quite that simple. And Dave brought up something, too, I thought about sometimes not always being less costly. I saw some of what I won't name agencies here, of course, but saw some of me where I saw things have backfired, where they've moved things off of their mainframes or off of their computing base they have in a data center to the cloud, but they still have a lot of stuff still in that data center on that machine. So now they're paying for what they had, plus they're paying for another service elsewhere. So it's got to be thought through in a lot of detail. But excellent points there. Sean Tierney, what do you think are some of the lessons you see that are being learned as you work your way through the process with helping your customers migrate through this?
Yeah, honestly, I think we're relearning a lot of the same lessons that we learned before, and we're relearning them in a cloud environment. In fact, a lot of the things that you just heard talked about are similar issues that we've seen in physical data centers, where we had to look at things like configuration management, compliance, continuous compliance enforcement, and policies and standards and things like that. The challenge I think we have with cloud is that before, when we were deploying physical infrastructure, it took you much longer to make a big mess. Now we can do it in minutes as opposed to days, weeks, or months. And we need that management framework up front to keep track of things. And we can do it in an automated fashion if we think in advance, like you're hearing, about planning out your application stacks, knowing what's going to have to move into the cloud. And once it's moved in, keeping track of it, automatically registering that into a CMDB and being able to look at one single pane of glass. I think the biggest challenge that we're seeing is that I think 80% of the customers that are using cloud environments are multi-cloud environments, and 50% are multi-hybrid cloud environments, which makes it exceptionally complex to manage. Having one tool where you can log into a single pane of glass and see everything that's out there, what the cross dependencies are, and how they operate is absolutely critical before you wind up with a virtual mess that you can't get your arms around.
Yeah, you're right, too. I think everything, the old saying, what goes around comes around. I think sometimes in computing, it's like a big pendulum, swinging back and forth. And I know when we were first trying to figure out what cloud was way back when, it sounded awfully synonymous to me to what we used to call time sharing back in like the late 70s, early 80s, where, hey, rather than have the stuff, let's use someone else's computing power or whatever. Now, and then that concept went away, and then here comes cloud. But cloud obviously has taken on a whole bigger life of its own. Chris Kearns, what do you think when it comes to some of the lessons learned? What do you see as some of the things you'd pass on to others as that you're picking up as you go through the process?
Sure, I'd agree with some of the others here that it's a fast-moving place, and I think because of both the maturity of the technology and the ease to use it, it can become attractive and luring. And so having that strategy up front and that governance process to approach it is the most critical element. The simple example I always like to use is it's, when you're going someplace, do you want to use public transportation or are you going to drive there? It really depends on where you're going. And I think each agency, each federal entity in the government, every even industry, they have to understand where am I going, why am I going there, and then avoid that lock-in so they have that flexibility, because the technology is moving so fast that things that we used to, build a whole new data center, move into that data center, and then you realize, well, there's commercial cloud available.
Sure.
Then you realize there's hybrid cloud available, and I can break that application into two pieces, and I can encrypt and just use it for storage and do my compute local. So there's a lot of different strategies that technology is making available, and you have to understand where you're going. The second piece is really getting our teams to figure out how and not why not, because I think there's a lot of that protectionism of, well, here's 100 reasons why we can't do that, as opposed to really getting them focused on how to go make it happen.
Right. Excellent points. Let's talk a little bit here, shift gears again, and let's talk about some of the challenges, things that are out there that you still need to accomplish, some of the constraints you need to get by in order to get where you really want to go with this stuff. Let's start with Dave again. Dave Mihelcic. Dave, what are some of the challenges that you face day to day that you still need to overcome in order to get where you're trying to go with this?
So I'd say our biggest set of challenges revolves around legacy policies and procedures, which are largely manually based. And to really get an advantage out of the cloud, you need to be automated. Everything needs to happen at machine speed. So if we have a traditional policy that requires, say, a security test to take place run by humans who write a report, that report gets reviewed and approved, and eventually you get a certificate, a certification and accreditation to go live, that process can take months. Now, that doesn't mesh with cloud speed, where we can turn up capability in minutes, and we pay for it as soon as it's turned on. So we're going to have to automate all of these legacy policies and procedures, not just security, testing, as well as deployment and management, so that we can truly take advantage of cloud economics and scale out computing, just like our industry has.
Yeah, I talked a number of times, too, about when the next generation of workforce comes in, things that we do today with accreditations and things like that can take a long, long time. But the new generation that enters the workforce, where they expect to pick up their phone and hit a button and whatever they need is there, is going to be a real challenge.
Well, funny story, in a recent meeting revolving around a cloud capability, I asked some of our engineers what they expected in terms of time to deliver the service. They said, we think we can stand this up in about 90 days. And I said, that's not going to be good enough. In a cloud environment, 60 seconds to 6 minutes is going to be your standard. Now, once we picked them up off the floor, we gave them 6 hours. So
Right. We're heading to an era where decision-making time will be approaching zero for decision-making. Frank Konieczny, what do you think, Frank, in terms of some of the challenges that you're facing?
Well, I'll tell you. I mean, culture, we might as well talk about that now, get over with.
Yeah.
I mean, that's been the big issue all along, is people like to have their things close by, and when you say, I want to give it to somebody else, they just don't want to do that.
And, of course, you get the award there for
Yes.
our 129th show. That's the 129th time the word culture entered the discussion while we're talking about challenges.
Yes. The contracting and the budgeting issues are there also, because of the way that the federal government actually manages their budgets. I mean, we have a cycle, a 3-5 year cycle out, and it's difficult to actually do that kind of demand budgeting that you have to do. Mm-hmm. So you have to watch it very carefully as to how that works. That's going to be a challenge to us as well. Contracting, we need more level 4 or 5 data providers. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're trying to get those right now. According for us, it has to be on the NetSense 2 contract, because that's our mandate to utilize those. And so we're working with DISA to actually bring some of those vendors up to level 4 and 5, because we need them desperately, because we don't have enough competition right now for doing that. The CNA is interesting, because that's a big deal. I mean, we also have mission C&D. How are you going to defend it in the cloud? How are you going to be able to get into the cloud to actually do the defense? What does, our 24th would like to be able to penetrate a commercial cloud to do some hunting sometimes.
Yeah,
well,
right.
that's very difficult.
Right.
And so the question is, how are we going to manage the defense when something goes wrong in a commercial cloud? That still is up for grabs as to how we want to do that, what T's and C's we want to establish into a contract, how much information has to be sent back from the commercial provider to support whatever activities we want to have, and then how much is that going to cost us? Because that's always an issue that we have, is how much is going to cost us.
Sure.
And the last one is, of course, the agility of the operation. We want to be agile, but it's very difficult because of the CNA issues that we have to have and everything else to establish the environment to actually do that agility. They do it right now if they want to do development work. They can go to Amazon or any of the providers and do their development. That's not a big deal, and they do that really quickly. But when we say we want to move it in production, things slow down to a crawl because you have to get all the approvals and everything else. We need to figure out a better way of actually getting that faster.
Excellent. Very good points there. Let's talk to Chris. Let's come back to Colonel Rozsnyai first. I think I missed you on the challenges here.
Okay, that's all right. We've got plenty of challenges that we could share, but I tell you, a number of them's already been talked at the table, and Frank already talked about the culture piece. And so we've got some things that we're doing. We've also got a host to the host classified information. So to kind of address both of those aspects, what we're looking at doing is a contractor-owned, contractor-operated capability, and we're looking to stand up a pilot probably down at Redstone Arsenal. And we're going through the cost-benefit analysis now for that to make sure that it's worthwhile and kind of pass with the common sense test. But we believe that by doing that, we can get more speed to innovation and leverage the industry's technology better. The other piece is there's some trade-offs, right? Not everything we already talked about. Not everything's really pertinent to be used in the cloud. Our operational force is not, they don't have the luxury of the high bandwidth and throughput that they normally have at home station and being always connected, so that assured level of communications. And so what we're doing right now is really taking a close look at all of the operational forces data impact level, data levels, and saying what elements can you do without for a period of time in the event you're disconnected. And then you can sync and resync that data once you get back connected, but you always have to have a certain amount locally in those environments if you're going to be successful in the combat environment. So the cloud, as it comes to our operational force, is very challenging, but we're making strides and doing some pilots in that area as well.
Excellent, excellent. And we'll come back. I want to hear from our industry guests on the challenges also that you guys are seeing and facing. But first, we're going to take a second short break. You're listening to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM. Welcome back to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM. I'm Jim Flyzik here with Colonel John Rozsnyai from the U.S. Army, Frank Konieczny from the U.S. Air Force, Dave Mihelcic from DISA, Sean Tierney from BMC Software, and Chris Kearns from Lockheed Martin. We're talking cloud computing in the DoD. We've talked about progress. We've talked about specific programs, lessons learned. And when we went to break, we had heard from challenges from our government guest and our DoD guest. But I'd like to hear from the industry perspective some of the challenges that you're experiencing. Let's start with Chris Kearns. Chris, what are some of the challenges that you see customers facing or that you're facing in helping your customers that you need to overcome to really get to where you want to go with cloud computing?
Sure. As the others have mentioned, there's no shortage of challenges. I think one of the greatest challenges, though, is the security areas. So the adversaries who want to take advantage of all this information and really kind of flip the business case of this on its head are constantly evolving as well. So we have to stay ahead of them. So from an industry perspective, the investments we're making to be able to support our customers to bring things up to those standards, to stay compliant with the codes, whether it be FedRAMP or FSMA or other components, they're kind of constantly in evolution. So it takes continual investment from the industry side, taking infrastructure that's FedRAMP certified to FedRAMP Plus and staying ahead of that. The second component of that, I think, is the inventory management, so that it doesn't become the wild, wild west of all these pieces going out there because there's so many options. So how do we kind of keep that governance and help our customers with knowing what's where and have that agility to pull it back out and put it someplace else if there's an issue, whether it be security or just operations components? Yeah,
right. Yeah, that security issue is one that we used to drill down and have just a question about security because it's such a key component of this. And I guess, my takeaway from all the discussions around that is cloud does offer sort of a way to step back and look at a holistic view of security. And because for years we've been doing Band-Aids and Band-Aids and Band-Aids and so forth. And now as you go to cloud, you can step back and say, is there a way we can look at this holistically and try to secure end to end right from the start rather than and get rid of some of those Band-Aids we've been applying all these years. Sean Tierney, what do you think in terms of, as you think through this and the things you're doing daily, what are some of the big challenges out there that need to be overcome in order to truly make cloud computing DoD successful and achieve all the objectives that are trying to be achieved?
I think for us, the biggest challenge that we're seeing is having the right conversation about what we want out of cloud in the first place. If you listen to Gartner and they talk about what's happening with IT in general, they say 75% of any organizational group is going to be bimodal in their IT strategy. I think in DoD, we're already probably close to 100% in terms of understanding what we want out of IT and the speed at which you have to balance infrastructure and rigor and diligence around speed and innovation and those sorts of things. So we heard an awful lot of conversation today about moving operations into the cloud, and there's great efficiencies to be gained there in terms of capacity, whether that's storage or compute power or things like that. But there's a focus on the efficiency gains there, whereas there's a completely separate side that we touched on a little bit but haven't dwelled on, which is the speed of development and the need for not moving infrastructure and operations into the cloud, but being able to very quickly stand up, test and dev environments, do some development, shut it back down again, and keeping track of that. So instead of gaining efficiencies in the infrastructure, you're gaining efficiencies in speed and not having to actually deploy infrastructure in the first place for that. Those speed conversations and being able to work with the cloud in a development lifecycle, and not just do that, but migrate that release process from test through QA into a firewall zone and then absolutely into production. That's happening at a much faster rate now, and there's tremendous conversations that we can have around cloud about managing those as well. But it's a different type of conversation than what you'd get from a cloud moving like a data center consolidation initiative.
Yeah, so it's certainly like challenging the traditional systems life cycle in terms of the various steps that we would walk through in developing DevOps and apps and so forth, and what I see is compressing, shortening, and creating opportunities for major improvements in efficiencies. Every show we like to talk about predicting what's going on out there in the future and where this is all going and what it'll mean to the government, what it'll mean to the country, what it'll mean to Americans as we work through these programs. What is always, it feels good to me about these discussions is you realize that what we're talking about here is not just about something that's going on in your environment. It's something that can impact, people right across the country and around the world. I mean, and it's one of the exciting things about being government employees or supporting government programs. So with that, we want to talk about the future here, talk a little bit about where we see this going in the future. What will information technology infrastructure look like as we continue this movement to the cloud trend, and how will it improve government services? Where do we see it ended? I'd like to hear from all of you. We got about 13 minutes or so left, and so we'll work our way down and hear all of you about your prediction. Let's start with Chris Kearns. Chris, as you look into your crystal ball there, or think down the road, look at the strategy. Where do you see this going? What's the computing going to look like down the road?
Sure. It's always dangerous to predict the future. I think it was Tom Watson, 1943, said there's market for about 5 computers. So, but I'll.
There's some of those stories are a riot when you look at some of the predictions that have been made in the past.
I'll go out on an edge here for you, and I don't think it's that far of an edge because I think automation is going to continue to drive things in this information age. So, I mean, we're seeing in the commercial markets, automated cars and all those types of things. I think in the IT space, both federal. We talked earlier about, automated provisioning, about single pane of glass, moving all of that. I think that's going to drive significant efficiencies and allow our customers to invest more of their resources in their mission, which is where they need to put their dollars. And I think we're going to continue to see that trend. Where the specifics of it are, I don't know all those areas, but a good example would be software-defined networking. I think software-defined networking will do to networks what virtualization did to data centers, and we're going to see a real rapid evolution of capability in that space.
Yeah, excellent analogy. So we do get to that sort of IT as a utility kind of model where the technology pieces will be there and the agencies and the DoD will be focused mostly on mission, and the technology will be there to support it. Sean, Tierney, what do you think? As you look down the road, what's the world look like to you with infrastructure and technology infrastructure, and what will cloud mean to how the world will work down the road?
It's a good question. We see 2 things probably driving the market. One is clearly automation. Automation is going to drive exponential increases in speed and dynamic flexibility. That's going to be an imperative to make this happen. But the other side of the coin that we see happening is this emphasis on consumerization. People want things, they want things quickly, and if it doesn't work, they're going to go to the next thing and look for another opportunity or another option to serve that. So I think you're going to see essentially the evolution of an iTunes app store for the warfighter, and you're going to see that across the government as well for civilian consumerization of government services. And I think you'll actually see DoD start to develop a service catalog portfolio that they can deploy out for the consumers of the services that they want to provide out there. And they'll just go to an app store and download what they need, and it'll be dynamically provisioned for them.
Wow, there's an app for that. It'll be the mantra, as someone talks to the chief technology officers, it'll be, what's the app for this? What's the app for that? Will be the future. Frank Konieczny, Frank, what do you see it all going down the road? What's your vision for down the road?
Well, the obvious trend is for, ubiquitous commoditization of IT services. I mean, that's obvious. The question is, how are you going to use them, and how is it going to be attached to devices and things? And I think you're going to find that there's going to be like normalization of tool sets that are automatically going to be able to use Hadoop and other cloud services like Excel without you even knowing about it. There's going to be a continuation of that, so that there's an extension of what your tool set is currently into a cloud environment without you caring about it. That's going to provide for the Air Force, obviously, airmen actually doing the mission they're supposed to be doing, as opposed to doing IT work, which is something we've been trying to do for a long time now with everything as a service.
Right.
But it's also going to be, what's going to happen is you're going to see more like cloud environments even in airplanes, which my cloud's in the clouds quote from way back when.
I like that analogy.
But that's what's going to happen right now. There's only so much space in an aircraft, but hyper-converged architectures plus cloud environments are going to change how you're actually going to do the battle. How you're actually going to look at environments and how you can dynamically change what's going on in an agile way.
I like that. Clouds in the airplane, as opposed to the airplane in the clouds. Some excellent points there, too, and I agree with you, especially the ubiquity issue and the customization and so forth, I think is going to be a major driver and a major trend of the future. Colonel Rozsnyai, what's it look like to you? What's that crystal ball look like? Where's this all going?
You were going to mention that crystal ball, and that's good because actually I have a crystal ball. It's on my desk, and it reminds me not to overly speculate to the future, because when I look into it, what I generally see is a funny reflection of myself. But but I will tell you that the CIOG6 is very much looking forward to the future, and right now, as a follow-on to our network campaign plan, we're working very closely with the science and technology community and academia to be looking out for those game-changing type technologies that are coming out on the horizon, so that we can take advantage of leverage them. Things like software-defined networking, bimodal IT, we mentioned already, improved algorithms, et cetera, those types of things. But I think at the end of the day, for the Army, it's really about the infrastructure and the information and the data, and being able to deliver that to the right person at the right time to make good, solid decisions. So the future and enhance overall collaboration throughout the department.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to watch some of these, Silicon Valley things that are happening and how they get deployed and brought in. And I mean, there's been so much hype around drones and driverless cars and landing airplanes with no pilots in them, and and so forth and so forth. And I mean, all that's going to eventually work its way back into the standard way of life and doing things. So. It'd be very interesting to watch this stuff all roll out. Dave Mihelcic, what's it look like for you, Dave? Where's this all going? Where I would think, being at DISA, you're kind of in a role where you need to think down the road with the support role that DISA provides across all of DoD. You need to be thinking about, what do I have to do to stay one step ahead of the curve here to make sure I can meet the requirements of our customer base. So where's this going to you? What's it look like for you?
So a couple of things. First of all, the advent of cloud computing and infrastructure as a service dramatically changes the equation for how we do legacy server-based computing. It makes it a big don't care. We can just automate that. We can buy it as a commodity. We can buy a shrink wrap package and run it ourselves. So that isn't going to be the real challenge moving forward. I think the real challenge and opportunity moving forward is going to be the convergence of mobile and cloud computing. So we see already mobile devices. Everyone has a smartphone. Most people have tablets. Many people have smartwatches now. Soldiers are getting embedded sensors in their body armor, in their opticals on their personal weapons. So we're going to see the mobile environment overtake the cloud environment. High bandwidth networking, ubiquitously deployed, means that essentially we're going to be able to converge that cloud in these central data centers with this mobile environment. And as the technology moves forward, we're going to see supercomputers on the hip. We're going to see petabytes of storage embedded in a watch. And so that's going to change the equation once again. So, Colonel, I think the future is bright for the Army because we're going to see this advance in mobile computing. We're going to see the advance in storage and processing that a soldier is going to be able to carry everywhere with them. And we're going to see the ability to manage that in an automated fashion so you don't have to have a technician following each soldier in the field. And what that's going to mean is we're going to change IT once again, and the equation is going to shift more towards the human with more capability and them acting as a ubiquitous sensor to feed data back to the rest of the cloud.
Right, I agree with that, and it's going to enable us to put the right information in the right people's hands to make the right decisions as where we need it.
It's going to be fun revisiting these challenges and lessons learned when we have the supercomputers in wearable devices. It's going
Well, I think we're only a couple of years away from that. And I know the Army has some great initiatives that are tracking just this.
It's going to be exciting stuff. It's going to be a real joy watching all this stuff evolve as we move along. As I always try to do, I try to take some notes as we go through this and do some summaries. I'll do my best to try to reiterate some of the great points I heard from all of you. We start off talking about progress, and we heard some things about the mill cloud. Still being private, but opening up, and we heard about cloud as a service. We heard about clouds within clouds, and in that definition, so we have the private, the public, and the hybrid clouds all seem to be evolving at a very rapid pace. Other things I heard on progress was a lot of talk about strategy being important to get done first. Strategy, planning, governance, things like that are very important in order to make progress. We heard about some of the platforms, email platforms. We heard about personnel recruiting platforms being things that are programs where tremendous progress has been made. And I heard about not only progress, but a lot of benefits coming out of that. Time being crunched down from 45 days to 10, I believe, is what we were talking about, and probably going to continue to do that. I guess my takeaway from our discussion on progress is cloud is real now. For years, it's been coming along, evolving. People have been talking about it as something new. It's no longer new. It's reality. It's the way we do business these days. Some of the specific things we heard about were the recruiting apps. We heard that there's over 500 apps now at Air Force that are being on the cloud. Defense Enterprise Email is a major success story and moving to its next generation already as the technology evolves. And we're actually moving more towards now to some of the level 4 things and some things in the world of NIPRNet and things like that, whereas before it was mostly focused on admin kinds of things or back office kinds of things. When we talk lessons learned, what came out strong was the transparency issue. I heard about provisioning and right sizing. One that was an interesting discussion was it's not always cheaper. You got to really plan this and think it through. And in some cases, it may not be cheaper out on version 1. You need to rethink it as to how do you improve it down the road to achieve those savings that are expected. An inventory of applications is a lesson learned. We don't want to take things we don't need and move them to the cloud, or take applications that are old or obsolete and move them to the cloud. We need to take a look at what we really need to move, and do we modernize as we move them. I heard from industry that there's a lot of relearning going on. There's a lot of new complexity that comes with this, things that's not seen just on the surface. So there's a lot of relearning. And again, on the lessons learned, I heard the word strategy and governance over and over and over. When we got to the challenges, something that jumped right out were legacy policies will not work in cloud environments. Some of the things we did in the past are no longer applicable as we move to cloud, and that speed issue is one that came out. Time to get policies and procedures in place is no longer acceptable the way we used to do it. We can't have certification accreditation processes that are going to take months and months and months and months and months. because the demand is, weeks or even days. The culture issue jumps out as it always does on these shows when you talk about challenges. People like to do things the way they always have. And I quote, I'm not sure, I think it was Robert Kennedy said, 1/3 of everyone's against everything all the time, no matter what it is. The agility issue came out as a challenge. We need to be agile, move quick, and security, of course. Future, we talked about moving from technology to mission. We talked about consumerization, ubiquity, software-defined networks. Changes, and in the discussion with Dave on mobility and supercomputing and wearables and what that will do for the future. With that, I want to turn and first thank our panelists for taking time from their very, very busy schedules to be here and share their wisdom with us. I want to thank our sponsors, without which we would not have a program. Thank the good people here at Federal News Radio. They always do a good job hosting this and making everything move smoothly. And of course, most importantly, thanks to the listening audience that tunes in and listens to the show. You've been listening to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM.